I'm going to talk about traffic signals, and that's because a few years ago when the pedestrian countdown signals came in Toronto, we decided to look at what they did, and they made things less safe for pedestrians. They did make, at least temporarily, more pedestrian and motor vehicle collisions. But I still think this piece of technology is useful. So the overview of my talk is that pedestrian injuries don't have to happen. I don't think I need to convince this crowd of that, but the devil is in the details. Our analysis in Toronto did show that we got more pedestrian injuries right after we installed countdown signals, but still I believe that traffic signals play an important role in reducing pedestrian injury risk, and I'm going to tell you why. Now, the first slide looks like an indirect plug for what Jean-Francois was just telling us. We're missing half our data. We know about vehicle volume. We don't know about pedestrian volume. We do know that on a divided highway with all vehicles and zero pedestrians, the pedestrian collision risk is 0. We do know that on Bank Street in Ottawa with no motor vehicles, the pedestrian injury risk is 0. If we know the anchor points and we know that there is some positive point, we know that there's a place where that curve goes up and there's another place where that curve goes down. But we don't know the shape of that curve. We don't know where we are on that curve. And we will never know if we only have half of the exposure data. We also know, if we look at this curve, that we're not talking about a linear function. We're talking intrinsically about a nonlinear function related to risk, and so some kind of approximation based only on vehicle volume just can't work. We need the other half of the data. It's quite possible that linear approximations will help us, but I think looking at the shape of this curve and realizing what we don't know about vehicle and pedestrian interactions always helps me when I sit down to write the limitations sections for my own papers. You can account for this with various bits of mathematical trickery, but you have to show people the tricks. Where are we in the terms of where an epidemiologist would approach this? I do go back to what William Haddon said about road safety in the 1960s. Think about before the collision. Think about during the collision, think about afterwards. Think about the equipment that's being used, think about the people, think about the environment in which they interact. Now, in a car, you can make something as safe today that you can drive it into a brick wall downtown at 40 kilometers an hour and expect to walk away probably without even orthopedic injuries. So that's pretty good, but that's right at the center of the kinetic energy interchange. Pedestrian countermeasures at the center of the kinetic energy interchange are not going to work as well. The car catcher, person catcher, whatever, I wouldn't spend a whole lot of money developing that for downtown Toronto. We can only make people so tough. But that tells us why speed is one of these sort of common risk factors that pops up everywhere. But the pre-event environment things that we can do are the most important things. I'm not going to propose rebuilding Toronto. If the budget is even $80 million over a few years, that's not going to go very far about moving everything around, which is why I like traffic lights, because you can retrofit them onto an existing environment. And if you take a little chunk of time and space, and during that little chunk you say there's either no cars or there's no pedestrians, then you can get yourself to one or the other of the safe ends of that curve. So that might be what this pedestrian countdown signal would be able to do, but what did it do in Toronto? Well, we put them in because when we changed all our regular traffic lights to LEDs, we still had these double yellow boxes because back in the day you had one light for walk and one light for don't walk. And so the decision faced by the city then is, do we sell a bunch of double yellow boxes and put in single ones now that they're all LED with a walk and a don't walk? Or, for very little extra cost, or in fact cost neutral, do we just put in a countdown signal? So we did, and we did it all fairly quickly. And so we looked at the effect of this program, and normalizing each intersection to work as its own control pre-post, when there are 2,000 of them, is a way of saying we don't think that the mix of cars and pedestrians at all of these intersections changed all that much over a 6-year period. But we didn't measure it, we just controlled for it mathematically by saying every intersection is its own control. So we saw a 26% increase in car and pedestrian collisions, and that wasn't the effect that anybody was going for. Why did that happen? We looked at car-car collisions as well, and we saw a similar effect. We saw a 7% bump up in vehicle-vehicle collisions at these same intersections. So what I infer from that is that the driver is looking at this countdown, and some of the drivers are spending the remaining seconds on convenience or their intention, which is to get through the intersection, rather than spending those seconds on safety. Or perhaps the driver is double thinking it and saying, actually, I don't have very long, but I don't want to get hit. And if I stop in anticipation of an orange and somebody else doesn't, then I get hit from the back, or whatever. Who knows what people are thinking, but what they're doing is crashing into each other more. So there isn't time and space there. And the pedestrians may be doing the same thing. And actually, if you do a little survey downtown here and go out and walk on University Avenue, see how the timers are spaced, see if you can cross with whatever your walking speed is, and see what other people are doing and whether they're spending that time on safety or on convenience. So I think that might be part of the answer. The other part of the answer, and we've been speaking with geographers about this, and our panel lead, Marie Soleil, is responsible for a lot of these maps. One day she's going to explain all of the techniques to me. Anyway, different places in the city, we have different area densities of collisions. You can see that downtown functions in a very different way from the inner suburbs of Toronto, and you can see that along the inner suburbs of Toronto, what is what is gathering the crashes is the major road system and not the neighborhood roads. What we tried to do is look at, for our all adults, for our children, and for our older adults, what happened pre to post with the pedestrian countdown signals region by region, and then compare that to what happened with the non-PCS sites. And really the signal that comes out of this is that if you're looking for places that had a significant increase, that related to adult collisions and older adult collisions, and it happened downtown. If you're looking for places that had significant decreases, there weren't as many. And if you're looking at results for children, the city got a little bit better, but everything is pretty spatially scattered. So we now know two things. We know that drivers and pedestrians probably use this information in a different way. And we also know that this same little light works in a different way, sometimes for safety and sometimes against it, depending on the exact context that you drop it into. And that's not surprising. There are all kinds of other studies on countdown timers. There are about a dozen of them. Most of them report improvements in safety. Some are measuring behavior, some are measuring conflicts. Not very many are measuring actual collisions. Small numbers plague all of this stuff, including ours, which is a pretty big treatment in a pretty big city. Regression to mean effects, you take your outliers and see what happened next year, they always look better, are typically ignored in this type of research as far as what's published, and area-wide effects are usually ignored. So we're trying to do as well as we can, again, with half of the denominator data not being available. For a bigger population of crashes with a similar kind of treatment, so you put in a red light camera and you see what it does to car-car crashes, there is enough robust research that somebody can meta-analyze it. And somebody has meta-analyzed it and has shown that you can estimate the local effects and the area-wide effects, that you see a reduction in collisions of 25 to 30 to 40%, depending on where you're putting these things, and that you can account for both regression effects and area. The signals are changing. This is how they work in Singapore. If you come in a wheelchair or if you come as an older person, you can tap your phone on the signal or your Singapore transit card. It will identify you as somebody who needs more time, and it will adjust to you the amount of time that you're given to cross the road. If it's used as part of an integrated system, and this is a study out of Miami that didn't say, let's see what countdown signals do on their own. It said, let's look at these two high pedestrian crash corridors, and let's apply the same kinds of treatment using a budget that includes implementation as well as evaluation. The interventions were all traffic controls. Countdown signals are in here, but so is changing the yielding, changing the mid-block crossing, eliminating some turning movements, all kinds of different things without actually rebuilding Miami. And if you look at what happened with that project as time passed, you reduce the count of pedestrian collisions if you take a corridor-based approach and put together a mix of interventions similar to what Roger Brown was talking about for Toronto earlier. So pedestrian injuries do not have to happen, and although our analysis in Toronto showed more pedestrian injuries with countdown signals, I believe that these signals can play a significant role in reducing pedestrian injury risk, and I thank you for listening.